Well, welcome all. We are thrilled to have you here for the Science of Longevity, a conversation with Coleen Murphy. I am Seth Green, and on a morning like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago, and I will welcome you to our gorgeous campus where big ideas are born that shape the world. And I will just say that if you are unfamiliar with the Graham School, you should be, because we are a trailblazer in lifelong learning. And we'll talk with Coleen about longevity, but I am guessing one element is to constantly be learning and developing and growing. And we are a place where that happens intellectually every day for people across all ages and stages of life. I'll share as well that we have a number of other exciting events coming up. For those of you who want to be in person with your peers in lifelong learning, we have our Liberal Arts and Society Symposium coming up on September 5th. And actually, pictured there is Nick Epley in conversation with our learners, and he does a lot of research on social connection and the value that may play in themes related to longevity. We're going to have a discussion next week with Harry Davis, Nancy Tennant, and Charlie Newell, who are the instructors of a new program called Navigating My Life Studio, and it's about navigating life's turning points. And then, very much building on this conversation, we'll be having a conversation on the art and science of thriving in life's second half with Dr. Kerry Burnright. But the reason that you are here today is for our conversation with Coleen Murphy. She is a professor of molecular biology and the Lewis-Sigler Institute for Integrative Genomics director at Princeton University. She is also the director of the Paul Glenn Laboratories for Aging Research at Princeton. And so, Coleen, thank you for joining us. And I'll start by kind of aiming to set the table a bit for the rest of our discussion. Your research really looks at the growing understanding that aging is a regulated process rather than simply cumulative cellular damage. And I'm curious if you can walk us through the paradigm shift itself and then what it means for the people out here who are very interested, but without your level of molecular biological knowledge.
Sure. First, I want to say just thank you, Seth, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about the stuff that I love working on. So I'm in the field of longevity regulation, which means that we're trying to understand this idea exactly as you said, a paradigm shift. This actually happened probably in the early 90s, really, with the discovery that there were these mutants, so not normal animals, that could actually live twice as long. And so that was work done by my postdoctoral advisor, Cynthia Kenyon. And we'll probably get into it, but that was in C. elegans, so this tiny little nematode. And the reason that that's such a powerful system is because that little tiny worm, which is really easy to work with in the lab, it shares about 75% of its proteins with us. So most of its genome is shared with us. So when we discover something in this really tiny little organism that only lives for 3 weeks, it means that we can extrapolate off and we can find the exact same gene in us. And so then we can better understand these molecular processes. Okay, so let me just back up and say what the state of the field was before the early 90s was this idea that it was sort of aging was going to happen. There's nothing you could do about it. It was this cumulative process that, you accumulate damage and there's just nothing you can do about it. But nature turns out to not work that way. And so this discovery that there were tweaks that you can make to the genome that would allow these tiny organisms to live twice as long. And when that turned out to be the insulin receptor, then immediately that gave us some insight into the idea that perhaps the whole aging process could be regulated. And if that's true, then of course, immediately you can make the inference that, of course, then you could modulate it, maybe with drugs, maybe with other interventions. And so that's really what opened up the whole field in about, she published that paper in 1993 and really building on it ever since. And so, at first everybody kind of ignored that because it was, you discovered a little tiny little worm that's just used in labs and people are like, well, who cares? But then later on with Gary Rubkin, so I don't know if you know him, but he's the guy who won, one of the two who won the Nobel Prize last year for RNA interference and small RNA. So he actually cloned that gene And so once we found out it was the insulin receptor, then it like sort of broke open the whole field. And so now there's really a ton of labs working on this idea that, in fact, aging is not just like this inevitable process that we can do nothing about, but there's lots of different ways that we can intervene. And so I'm sure that you're going to ask me about some of those, Seth, because there's a bunch of different ones. And it's actually kind of, I think, a ray of sunshine for us to be able to hope that we can actually do something to slow the process of aging.
Yeah, so that is a very exciting discovery. And yes, I want to spend a lot of our conversation going through the different strategies that people can think about as they aim not necessarily to avoid aging, but to take it on gradually and be able to continue their thriving amidst
Mhm.
aging. Let's start, though, with a bit of history, Colleen, because your book beautifully describes both the history and the current state of aging research. And you cover genetics, the gut microbiome, cognitive function. And so can you paint a bit of a picture about, kind of what we knew,
Mhm.
and then maybe we'll come after that, where the kind of most promising frontiers are now, and how that's changing.
Okay, so I'm just going to give a little background. So for those of you who don't know, I'm at Princeton University, and I finally got to teach the class I wanted to teach, which is on the molecular regulation of aging. And so that allowed me to gather all these materials. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you about is not work from my own lab, which I'm very happy to spend a ton of time, but I really like the whole field. Okay, and so yeah, before this idea that you could regulate aging, there was a hint of that. Based in back in the 30s, there was the observation that rats that were deprived of enough calories actually, surprisingly to the researcher doing the work, they actually lived longer and they had less disease. So that sort of, there's been in the field for a long time this knowledge that caloric restriction, which probably most of the listeners have heard of, it could be beneficial. Okay, and so I would say in that field, we're recognizing that it may not in humans extend lifespan so much, but caloric restriction could actually reduce things like the onset of disease, et cetera. Um, I'm not a big fan of caloric restriction because I think it's a terrible way to live. And so one of the things that I'm excited about in the field is this idea that you could intervene if you know the molecular processes. So that's what I kind of think often gets lost in the news is the reason we're not just doing the same experiments over and over again to just, show that animals can live long enough. What we're trying to discover is what are the molecules that regulate, so the proteins that regulate these processes. So then you could do things like design drugs that would intervene. And I think actually one of them, and I'm kind of getting off track with your original question, but I think one of the original observations that you could caloric restrict, um, soon after my book was finished, I turned it in and there's all, and immediately exciting thing. That's right when Ozempic and all the GLP-1 agonists came out. And that's really starting to show that intervention at like with obesity and diabetes and those kind of things actually have really beneficial effects on all kinds of processes. Okay. So that's sort of the caloric restriction field. And there's other drugs. You guys might have heard of metformin. That's another thing that's supposed to intervene in the caloric restriction area. But while we've been in the process of discovering all, doing, for example, genetic screens to identify new pathways that would regulate aging, we found all kinds of other pathways that can actually slow aging. And so it's not just all about caloric restriction. I open with that because that's really what was known in the field. And insulin signaling is a separate pathway. And then we have all these other functions that happen in the cell. For example, the recycling of proteins through a process called autophagy. That's actually that's actually turned out to be really helpful for not just aging, but also things like cancer treatments. Proteostasis, keeping all of your proteins healthy and turning them over when they get damaged. That's hugely important. And so in the book, what I do is I try to help readers go through all these different processes that have been discovered because in some ways they're additive and sometimes they're like some things are additive and other things are controlled by the same regulatory pathway. And so that's what the field has been discovering. There's all these different ways to slow the aging of the cell, or in some cases, help regeneration, like if you can help cells replace themselves. And
Mhm.
so there's there's just been an explosion of new pathways. And what that means for people is that eventually we'll be able to find interventions that can really help with a lot of the age-related diseases that we're experiencing. And so I think there's going to become many, many options for that approach. So we're kind of in this interesting time right now where we're
Yeah.
moving from lab observations and identification of possible molecules to affect to really like starting biotechs, and eventually those will become drugs.
Well, so let's dig into these
Yeah.
different areas. And since you start with caloric restriction, maybe we'll start there.
Yeah.
Your point, I know, is that there are multiple ways to potentially achieve this, including through medicines like GLP-1s that
Yeah.
might lead someone to have less appetite. Can you talk a little bit first about why, as according to what we know, and I know we don't know everything yet,
Yeah.
1930s, we start noticing caloric restriction might actually positively impact. It's 2025. I know we're still learning about why, but as far as the field has gone today, why would caloric restriction, whether individually, disciplined or through some, drug encouragement, why that is positive? And then I'll just maybe add on another piece to this question, Colleen, because I've been fascinated by some of the writing of Derek Thompson at The Atlantic. And I don't know
Hmm.
if you've come across his work, but recently he wrote about caloric restriction, and he wrote about how we've gone from a relatively scarce world from a caloric standpoint to one today, which is a caloric rich world, and the foods are highly palatable. So he did some research that I hope you find is not entirely off base, because he's not a molecular biologist like you, but to basically say that per person, for example, in the US, we went from a place where there were something like 3,200 or 3,300 calories available per person to now it's over 4,000, just as the food industry grew. And so
Yeah.
suddenly we're in a world where there's caloric abundance, but our bodies were built for the presumption of caloric scarcity. And so I'm curious to hear generally what we know about why caloric restriction works. And then I'm curious your thoughts on that potential context that we've gone from this shift in caloric scarcity to caloric abundance, and yet at the same time, our bodies can't shift overnight from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah. And so if I think that's a great entree, but I would start, we probably shouldn't, well, I'm not going to start with humans because actually all of these pathways are present all the way down, at least to C. elegans. So, and they work in exactly the same way at the cellular level. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because I think we have to often back up and view these regulatory processes about how they evolved in the first place before and when there's like, the original, the Ur ancestor of all of us. And the truth is, these pathways, what they do is really what they're regulating is not lifespan. They are regulating the ability of an animal to have enough nutrients and make a decision to reproduce or not. Okay, so if we think about a tiny worm, it's making a decision. Okay, I'm sensing I have nutrients, so all systems on go. Develop as fast as possible, have as many progeny as possible, and then I think we have to view this post-reproductive lifespan. It's just extra. In
Right.
fact, I had a student who did a cute senior thesis where he looked at post-reproductive lifespan across all kinds of organisms. Okay. And it turns out that time actually scales with the size of the progeny that the mother's trying to have. And so every woman who's been pregnant can relate to this. And so if you think about you're most likely to live longest if you have this excess health, basically, whatever in an animal, it's like some high level of fitness post like reproductively, then will live longer. Okay. And so these animals, they're shifting, they have to have this ability to regulatorily shift their development and reproduction and overall health in response to nutrients. Okay.
Mm,
So think about it this way. So an animal, let's say just imagine a random, like whatever animal is in an environment where suddenly they have no nutrients. It's not a smart decision then to reproduce and put out your progeny into an environment where they're going to starve to death. So the best thing would be to put the brakes on, slow things down, and so then, like, stretch out this time of pre-reproduction so that then you get to a place where there's more nutrients and then turn off the brakes and start reproducing. Okay. So that was a regulatory pathway that existed in our, far back ancestors. And so if we're trying to think about humans, it's a little bit hard to think about just in the past, like 100 or 200 years. because
Right.
it's true, it's a time of scarcity, but these regulatory pathways didn't evolve
Right. They
in
evolve
a
over millions.
small time, right?
Yeah.
Now, as far as our health goes, it is true that we basically were not like there, people normally didn't have not only the access to calories, but I will say, and you saw this in my book, there's, considerable, especially in the United States, considerable subsidies to companies to put a lot of excess things like, especially from the corn industry, into foods. And so we're actually, even when we think we're eating kind of healthy, we're probably not eating as healthily as we can. And so, yeah, it's hard to avoid having too many calories. So, but if we think about the cellular level, the cells are taking in a lot of calories or a lot of energy. And so they're working on high speed. But the result of that is that then your proteins actually get made and they can start to accumulate damage. And so if the cell can't keep up with protein, like damage to all its components, it's going to do badly. And what the thing that caloric restriction, this has been universally across all these model systems have shown, is that slowing down, like reducing nutrient intake, slows down the production of everything at the cellular level, which gives it time, gives the cell time to repair. So that's kind of at the cellular level, that's what's happening with caloric restriction. And so you can imagine, like at a systems-wide level, if you're slowing things down a bit so they can repair, that's kind of what's going on. But again, like who likes to not eat? Not,
Right.
not me. So I'm kind of interested in figuring out how we can do things that are healthy for us, but still have a high quality of life.
Well, so let's dig in beyond caloric restriction,
Yeah.
because your book looks at a lot of different strategies. And maybe we can start with the strategy that you think is the most effective as we think about healthy aging. What is that strategy? Why is it important? And how do
Okay.
we understand how to apply it to our own lives?
Okay, so like I said, I'm very enthusiastic for the direction that we're going from labs to biotechs to drug companies. But the truth is, no matter what, everyone in the audience, whatever you're doing, you should try to find some form of exercise. Because the more that we learn about exercise, the more beneficial we find out that it is. And so for people who are relatively sedentary, even starting to walk is actually super helpful. The thing that's been kind of a shift in the exercise field in the past decade and a half or so is that really using our muscles like strength training is actually super beneficial. And the older you get, the more beneficial it is because it does a different kind of thing than just cardio to your body. So that's just a general thing. And I'm not a doctor, so it's not like a prescription, but I'm just saying that's an easy thing. Um, if ever, whatever you can do to increase your sort of daily use of your muscles turns out to be highly beneficial. And from the scientific point of view, we can see some of that. For example, for the muscles themselves, actually stimulating helps them grow mitochondria. So using your muscles actually helps your mitochondria turn over and do better. And then there's actually one of the really exciting parts of the field is the idea that when muscles are exercised, they actually release chemicals into called well, there's mitokines, but there's various factors that get released into the blood. And the things that go in the blood actually end up going to your brain. And so exercise is not just helpful for keeping your body generally healthy, but also can it help with your cognitive function. And cognitive function to me is probably the most important thing for us to maintain. And so that's where I'm kind of interested in, like, can we develop drugs that will help with cognitive aging? But certainly at a base level, exercise seems to be really beneficial for almost like everything, not just the rest of our bodies, but our brains as well.
And as we think about exercise,
Yeah.
Colleen, you said, moving, just getting going if you're sedentary.
Mhm.
Are there specific interventions that we're learning about that are particularly valuable from an aging perspective? And when I say that, I'm thinking both physically, but
Yeah.
also brain function, mentally,
Yeah.
agility, all of those pieces.
Yeah, that's why I'm focusing on the things like strength training, resistance exercise, and not so much on like it's nice to do crosswords, but it turns out that's really not it turns out a lot of the brain training things are actually specific for that function and not generally applicable. But I would say I think that's probably like from one study where they like looked at like just specific things. I think there's something that we cannot study in C. elegans and or Drosophila and mice, and that is this general idea that being interested in life and learning more things all the time. And having the other part is the social aspect. So making sure that people continue to interact socially, those are kind of we observe from human studies are actually very, very beneficial, but harder for me to like model in a, in a genetic system. So I think that keeping engaged in life and keeping socially active, there's actually good evidence that those are very beneficial on top of the exercise. So I guess if I were making a plan, I would say, get some exercise every day, try to eat some fruit, go hang out with your friends a bit, and try to read something that you find interesting. So those would be like kind of the things that I would say are really beneficial. And probably the people who are listening to this right now kind of can attest to that, right? Learning something new is actually keeps you young.
So I want to come in a moment to some of the ethical questions
Mhm.
around all of this. But before we get there, I just want to lay one more thing on the table. We talked about nutrition from a caloric restriction standpoint. You name that is not necessarily the happiest way to age well. Another piece, though, I know is nutrition itself. So not just how many calories, but what you are actually taking in.
Yeah.
Can you just talk briefly about some of the findings you lay out in your book there, and then we'll jump into some of the bigger intellectual questions around this whole space of longevity.
Okay. So again, I'm not a clinician, so I don't think that I think there's probably better nutritional studies that can be talked about. I will say that one of the goals of the field for a long time has been to ask this question. For example, is it better to, you always read about all these different diets, right? Like high protein, low carb. Um, and what's been confusing, I think, for everyone is that almost every study comes to a slightly different conclusion. And I think part of that is because evolutionarily. So if you study something in C. elegans or Drosophila, and you want to do, there's been beautiful studies. For example, Scott Pletcher's lab did this really nice matrix of carbohydrate and proteins, and they found like a perfect, like what was the optimal for a Drosophila lifespan. And so while I usually like to extrapolate from like model systems to humans, I kind of suspect that actually what's happening with nutrition is every organism has an optimal set point that's not necessarily the same as another organism based on what they evolve, what's kind of, environment they evolve to be in. And so I think that's the core reason that you read in the newspapers, like it seems like the dietary field, um, you get different advice if you wait 5 years. And
Right.
so I think that's been really confusing for people. And that's why I kind of am being evasive because I actually don't know if there's going to be something in 2 years that says that's all wrong. You might have noticed in my book, I did mention a study. One of the things that has been very popular is this idea of intermittent fasting. Okay. The idea that you would like fast all day and then like only eat like in certain periods. And so there are certain people, I will note mostly men, who like really adhere to that and say they're the healthiest they've ever been. And so there was a really interesting study where they took a lot of people and had them do this and compared them. This is important because most people, can't do the study on yourself because you don't have
Right.
the control, right? And so they compared with people who also came in and just kept track. They didn't tell them when to eat, they just kept track of what they ate. And they got the same results.
Hmm.
Okay. In fact, actually, the intermittent fasting group did worse because what they lost was they lost muscle. And so you don't want to do that. So the truth is, I think you get the same results in all these studies if you compare them against people who actually just kept track of what they ate, because we do a lot of like, I don't know, mindless eating. And so, and I'm not actually like, I'm not a person who thinks a lot about dietary stuff, but I think it was really interesting that that study showed that it kind of didn't matter when you ate, despite all this
Hmm.
stuff that we'd seen. So I think it's a confusing. My own lab doesn't study dietary restriction because I have been so underwhelmed by all the work in it, even though I understand it's very popular because it feels like something everybody could do. Okay, there was something that just popped up, and it's great that somebody reminded me. Sleep. I forgot to mention sleep, and one of the commenters wrote. Um, that actually is becoming we're becoming more and more aware of how important sleep is. And in fact, one of my other roles is I'm the director of the Simons Collaboration on Plasticity and the Aging Brain, because cognitive aging is really what I'm interested in. And we have actually two groups that are really focused on the role of sleep and why does sleep help us like clean up our brains and help us function better. And so I should have added that. And it's, sometimes longevity, the field is a little weird because a lot of the stuff is exactly what, like your mom would have told you. Get enough sleep, eat right, get some exercise, which is a little bit of a drag. But now we're understanding molecularly why that might be true. And then I really want to make this point because you mentioned the ethical point. A lot of times,
Colleen, before we leave sleep,
yeah,
though, I just want to
yeah,
hear so what? Is it the amount of sleep? Is it the quality of sleep? Is it the combination? Is
okay,
there an amount? Because I've seen vastly different reports. Sleep is viewed as important, but I've seen things that go from 6 to 8 hours as the needed. And then I've seen,
yeah.
you may have your own sleep needs versus a global one. And so I'm curious just for it's important and what is the recommendation for lay people like us who are thinking
Yeah.
about how to do it well?
Okay, so I think that the jury's still out, and that's why there's so much excitement about the field, and so because people are
Yeah,
trying to answer those questions. So, and your last point that like it would be there's optimum, there's an optimal probably for every single person. I know a guy who only needs to sleep 4 or 5 hours a night, like, he's probably a mutant, right? So it's probably something that allows him to do that, that doesn't allow the rest of us to function that way. And so there's going to be like average suggestions, like 7 to 8 hours of sleep, I think. But sleep deprivation is really bad. And that
right.
seems to be because of this basically glymphatic system you need to rest in order for your brain to clean out toxins. That's the thought. And so getting sleep deprivation is super damaging. And you can actually see this in these scans that people do. So that was one thing. But you had mentioned you'd asked a question about the ethics. And if
Yeah,
you
yeah, no, and I want to, just put out that question, and then we'll hear your response. So, this is a field that is, as you said, moving deep into biotechnology and innovation. The kind of classic, almost stereotypical example now is the Silicon Valley bro who is, figuring out how to gamify this and get to 150 potentially. And what that really, I think, speaks to, which is a true thing, because I think that's still an aberration, is we are seeing a huge death gap in society today. And that is likely to grow as we know more about aging, but only a certain group of people have access to actually apply all of that knowledge. And so I'm curious kind of how you think about the ethical implications of all these discoveries. We're at the frontiers, and then there's all of this biotechnological development, but access to this innovation is still relatively narrow. And so how do we think about, obviously it's great for society to have innovation, it's great to have new discovery. At the same time, how do we think about the access and other implications?
Yeah. So as you know from reading my book, that's one of my deep concerns as
Yeah.
well. Um, And that's part of why when my lab does things, we do, for example, our drug screens on FDA approved drugs that are relatively cheap. So that because you can have second uses for things that have,
Mm.
and metformin is an example of that, right? So that's a relatively cheap drug. Of course, uh, all the new discoveries, there's not really a good way to get around the fact that when you like do all these studies, you find some new protein that nobody knew about, you need to find a drug that activates that. There's a certain amount of research and funding that needs to go into that development. And so in order for that to eventually make it out to patients, there has to be a lot of money put into that. Okay, so there is going to be a problem at some level that some things are not going to be very equitably distributed.
Yeah.
And I think that that's true of almost every medicine you see, right? So there's cancer drugs, all kinds of things that like because of that um, necessary step to get them to the point where they can actually make it out to patients, things are expensive. And so I think the only way around that is to move forward with developing them and then hope that eventually those become cheaper. Um, but there are a lot of things, just health inequities in general. Like our society is very, you know, the the sad truth is, even if you didn't ever receive any drug from any of these like longevity trials, the way to live long is to be white and rich. And so, because there's so many barriers to health for many people. So if you are of a lower income, you might have, for example, you might be working more night shifts. You might have far less access to groceries stores in your neighborhood. You might have access to no like fresh fruit or vegetables in your neighborhood. You may never have an opportunity to exercise. So, and you may not get enough sleep. So there's lots of things that happen that are not to do with the science that we do in a lab, but basically just with society that keeps people from living as long as they possibly could. And I actually think that that's one role that we all need to be aware of, that like making society more equal actually will raise our average lifespan before we ever
You know,
get
I
to
think
like
it's
a
a
drug.
very compelling point in the sense that, you're developing some of these frontiers for people who may have these other pieces.
Yeah,
But if you're thinking about how do I best improve longevity in the country, for example,
exactly.
how do we raise life expectancy? The first thing you do is address poverty because that's probably the least expensive way to get a big bump. And indeed, when you look at comparative studies, I know you've done this, and the
Mhm.
US has a lower life expectancy than lots of our industrialized peers who spend half as much on healthcare. And the context is just that they have a much more even spread, and this low tail that coincides with poverty. I know there's debates about exactly the cause, but coincides. That is a place where we see a lot of decline compared to our peers in terms of longevity.
And I just want to make the point, given the news, that the reason that we live as long as we do today is not because of any longevity drug. I mean, we do have had bumps from like statins and other treatments of some age-related diseases like cardiovascular disease. But let me make it clear, the reason that all of us have made it to adulthood is because of vaccines.
Right.
And the assault on vaccines in our country is going to kill people, and it will definitely shorten lifespan. And we're going to see that immediately if access to COVID-19 vaccines are limited, and things like we already see it with things like measles in children. And so I can't in good conscience leave this conversation and pretend that things are still the same as when I published this book 2 years ago. We are in dire straits as far as public health goes today because of the choices been made by the current administration.
Well, so we have a lot of questions for you, Colleen, and I'm going to start them off, but we'll make them
Yeah.
almost cow around because I think we have about a dozen for you in the next dozen or so minutes. So we're going to start with Sheila Barrett. She says there have been villages in Italy and Greece, and you've probably heard about blue zones as well, where the population has demonstrated exceptional longevity. Have these people been studied? Is it primarily a factor of genetics? What aspects of their lifestyle can we apply in our lives? What can we learn from these longevity innovators?
Yeah, I think, okay, so probably most of you have heard something about blue zones, and that's actually been recently debunked a bit. Um, Part of that is because a lot of times for these original studies, um, some of the health record, like the actual birth certificates, were not, people didn't know how old they were. But it is true that one of the things that a lot of these, for example, these cities and or villages and things in Italy and Greece are people walk. People carry stuff and they walk around a lot and they actually are like using their bodies their whole lives to do things. And it's not because they're eating fewer carbs. So like it really seems to do about like their lifestyle.
Yeah.
And so there, but you could also argue probably most of the people in those villages share the same genetics. So maybe we just don't know how to end. So I think we can take some lessons from them, but I don't think we actually know anything about the causes, like why people live that long.
15 years ago, James Mesrobian writes, there was considerable attention upon polyphenols and sirtuin proteins, with many proposed health benefits. Are polyphenols still an area of active research?
That was a case where I think there was, and it's actually damaging to the longevity and aging field when there's so much focus on one particular thing. So James is absolutely right. There was this idea that resveratrol would be some magic drug. And in fact, actually, I did a study in C. elegans where we showed that actually did increase lifespan. Pharmaceutically, it kind of went nowhere. It was a company that was bought, and then like the company that bought it shut down the program because couldn't um, they couldn't see the same results. And so there's considerably less interest, although now we know besides the original SIR2, there's lots of other proteins in that field, in that category called sirtuins that do other jobs in the cell. So I'm not writing that off completely, but this idea, this all came, often it was the French paradox, right? That French people drink wine and still live long and stuff, but they walk around a lot and they have socialized medicine, healthcare. So I think, attributing that all to the polyphenols in red wine was a mistake in the first place.
Although a very happy mistake. What a great way to interpret the thing. It wasn't they're walking, it was just drinking wine.
Drinking
What could
wine,
be
yeah,
a better way to get that longevity benefit? Like
exactly.
not all things can just be based on what we want. Greg Gosick writes, what is the most plausible estimate of the ultimate longevity bottom line? In other words, if you're adopting these best practices, is there likely a hard constraint to maximum attainable lifespan? I was fascinated on this note, Coleen, to realize that the person who had lived the longest died a number of years ago. So it's not like we've seen that longevity in number, in a total number, like that heroin longevity of the person who's lived the longest changing dramatically based on all of this. But can you talk a little bit more about that and maybe, separate out health span, because I know people are getting a lot of health span benefits
Yeah.
versus lifespan, and how, as I understand it, a lot of this innovation is extending our health span but not necessarily changing the possibility of the number of years that people will live. But you can, I'm sure, share more about that.
Okay, so let's just back up and say like every single person who's lived a long time, say like 114 to 118 years, has not had access to anything we're talking about, and not resveratrol, metformin, or any other like longevity drugs, right? So that's kind of the case of like almost the baseline of what a human maximum lifespan is. But we don't really know what that maximum is. And there was a controversial paper that was published in Nature maybe a decade ago where they claimed to say that 115 was the maximum lifespan, which obviously isn't true because like there's a few people every once in a while who live longer than that. Um, but it does seem to hover around like the sub 120 years. Um, what would be the maximum if you actually did all the things that we are in the process of discovering? I don't think we know that. And then there, of course, these like completely wild claims that the person who's going to live 500 years has already been born. Who knows? I don't think we know that answer. And for me, it's kind of like, I guess, a fun thing to talk about, but yeah, and all those people who did that, if you look at what they say about their own lives, it's always a funny story. They're always like, oh, it's from drinking like a glass of whiskey every day or something, something completely that we know is not the reason they live long. The people who live an exceptionally long time are probably blessed with like exceptional genetics. And we've learned some by looking at collecting together all the information we can from people who are these super centenarians. We can glean like there's a few genetic mutations that help people live a long time. Like they might have all the other diseases in their background, but they just don't succumb for them. And so there are a few things, and those are usually turn out to be in the pathways we're already studying. These things with cholesterol or insulin signaling. So, maximum lifespan may be around 115 to 120 without any interventions. So we'll see what happens in the next couple of years.
All right. Well, it will be a very big suspense, I think, as we discover what the
Yeah.
possibilities are. We have a number of questions about sleeping. I'm going to combine them here. So one is about this idea that it's helping to filter out toxins, and they wonder, is napping effective for that, or is it only the deep sleep potentially at night? And then another question here is about for older people who have trouble going to and staying asleep, should they be taking medication to help them sleep better on a regular basis? Or you made the point, it's really about avoiding sleep deprivation. So I guess just your tips on how to think about, sleep cycle, does napping work? Could medication to help sleep be effective? Is it necessary? I know it's not an exact science at this moment, it's still an
Well,
emerging one, but what do we?
actually, yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but I would love to know the answer myself. So there's a sleep collaborative group through the Simons Foundation, and these are exactly the questions they're asking,
Yeah.
but I don't know the answers yet. I'm always the one like, because I want to know, right? Because there's these terrifying studies like, oh, someone who has like interrupted sleep, they're going to eventually suffer from Alzheimer's disease, and you can't know what's cause and effect, right? And I'd really love to know that. Um, so I wish I knew the answer, and I don't know. They're studying exactly those are great questions, and they're exactly the questions that these groups are studying. It does suggest there's certain phases of sleep that are more beneficial. And I don't know, it is a great question. If you just nap, are you getting into that phase right away? I don't know. And so that's, but you can see that there's these amazing videos looking at, I think it's fMRI, but they're looking at the brains as someone sleeps, and you can see this sort of washing of like, and they're looking at damage. And so, I wish I had an answer. I'm really sorry to the crowd that I don't have an answer. It's ongoing research that I think will be coming out in the next like probably 3 or 4 years.
All right, great. Well, we will make sure we're wide awake for those answers. There is another set of questions here around this idea of what is described as cliff-like aging, where new research is suggesting that aging is not necessarily a gradual linear process, but rather involves distinct cliffs or sudden shifts in biological or molecular processes, with some studies indicating these changes can happen around 34, 44, 60. They're wondering if you could talk about that. And then they're asking for people over 70, which maybe they have personal interest in, are there additional cliffs that they should be ready for?
Yeah, so this was research. You've got a very well-informed crowd. So this is research that came out in the past year or so, looking mostly at these sort of molecular, like biological clocks. Now, I'm going to make a catty comment. I think that every woman in the crowd knows exactly that, like, there's some shifts that have been noted and completely ignored by science for too many years. For example, menopause. And there already have it's been noted that there's actually a time of accelerated aging for women um, in the menopause period. And so I was kind of surprised when this came out that anyone was surprised by this because we all have witnessed this. But maybe it was a surprise to the dudes. Okay. I think that yeah, the two that they noted were around the 40s and 60s. Post 70s, they didn't notice a real cliff, but I think if we're talking about health span, I think we all know that there's this idea of comorbidities. They're basically things that seem to all sort of like pile up at the same time. So the question is, why didn't that study come out with something that appears at that period? Because I think we know that that exists. And so I think that post 70, there is a cliff, and I think we all kind of observe. So the question is, why didn't they observe it there? Now, I'm going to fold into this idea, this maximum lifespan, because there was an interesting observation when people have been trying to understand demographers, trying to understand this idea of maximum lifespan, that once people hit an age of 105, they seem to like almost have like like they didn't experience an acceleration of mortality. So that's not helpful if you're not planning to make it 105. But I think we're still learning what exactly is this like cliff-like thing, because that study didn't associate with any particular molecular signature. Like we don't know what that meant. It was just sort of an observation.
So we have a handful of questions left. I'm going to try to group them together, Coleen. And one is about how well we do in science and medicine with what sounds like a multidisciplinary set of factors, but then you're seeing individual physicians and they're looking at a very particular piece. We have another question here about what factors or biometrics you recommend. And I'm familiar with the rise of functional health, where you're trying to look across all these biometrics and then be more proactive and see how things connect within the body rather than treat things as individual diagnosis and intervention. And so to link all those things together, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about there's all of this scientific innovation happening. Then you have the medical complex that is still kind of looking at a disease and intervening. Can you talk a little bit about where you think we are in being able to bring what is interdisciplinary knowledge into our current medical system? And maybe in that context, give us any of your perspective on this rise of functional health.
Okay. All right. So let me just say that because there's a question about collaboration. So the way scientific research used to work until the NIH has been destroyed was that we would receive funding to study a question in great detail, so we really understand it, and then we just disseminate that information through publications and through going to give talks. And at a lot of these meetings, like I go to a bunch of different types of meetings, some are really narrow and some are really broad. And at these broad meetings, we get to know people and hear information about all these different types of studies. Okay. Now, how that gets to the medical field is like, as you mentioned, it's a little bit like not as clear, but there's been an interesting rise of things called longevity clinics. And
Right.
so longevity clinics, people running, they're really interested, and this really happened post-COVID because a lot of people suffering from uh,
Right. Long COVID.
yeah, long COVID have noticed that they experience kind of like an accelerated aging. There's a lot of hallmarks that are similar to accelerated aging and to um, some other disorders. And so uh, several groups have gotten together and said, okay, we're going to look at it holistically and try to really track, like biometrically, like what are the things that actually tell us what kind of health someone's in. Usually middle age. This is usually people who are in their like 50s or 60s get interested in this, 40s to 60s. And then what can we do to improve those metrics, the things that we can measure, things like resting heart rate, sleep. That's actually like you can measure sleep, right, with your
Yeah.
Fitbit. Um, CO2, VO2 max. So those kinds of things are getting measured. I don't think that part I think is not an exact science. That part is where people are trying to like take what they know from all these different areas and put it together and give a particular patient some advice. Some of which I've already told you about, like kind of like, things you already know, but somehow like having someone else tell you to do it often results in it happening, right? Um, yeah, so I think the awareness, the fact that you have a whole group of here listening to this is one of the things that's going to get this out to the general public, right? Things that we should be doing. And then eventually, someone asked about metformin and some other things. Like there's something called the TAME trial. And that's the idea behind that, since that's a cheap drug, is to ask if you give people this affordable drug, will you see improvements in things like health span, age-related diseases? And so I think that is the kind of thing where then a physician might be more comfortable than
Right. Prescribing.
prescribing something like metformin, even to people who don't have diabetes. And I think that's the real thing that's going to change is allowing prescriptions for, you know, aging, which
Yeah.
is not technically by the FDA right now considered a disease, but you could imagine getting treatment for it from some of the already available drugs that are not even that expensive.
Well, Colleen, this has been a fascinating conversation. I will say I feel lucky every day to be in my role, but especially when I'm not only learning intellectually, but also I have a list of items I want to now incorporate into my lifestyle so that I can hopefully age well and continue to learn from incredible people like you. Thank you for what you've done for the field. And maybe I'll just close with a quick story. I'll give you the final word. We have a wonderful initiative here called Leadership and Society Initiative, where individuals at the end of their longstanding career, but who want another generative chapter of purpose, come to the university for a year and think about where they want to go next. And one of the fellows who just completed her fellowship, she had been the CEO of Deloitte Consulting,
Mhm.
and she came here and worked with a number of biologists here and actually came to the same observation that you shared earlier, that women are living longer, but their health span goes earlier. And so they live nearly twice as many years with life and not health. And they then saw that there was a huge lack of investment in this whole marketplace because the people that had often been doing the investing just didn't have proximity. And so, anyway, has built this fund now, an impact investment fund, with that exact goal in mind to try to address that issue. So as you shared your observation about how, it might be the dudes who are unaware of these cliffs, wanted you to know that we have a business leader, but now empowered by wonderful biologists here who's trying to address it and hopefully build a new market for what could be a really important health intervention. So any final words for our audience before we go?
I think that a lot of people have the general intuition of the things that will keep them living longer and healthier. Um, my book is a little bit on the science side of understanding the genetics and molecular biology underlying that, but I hope that you do come away with this idea that there are things that we can do to at least even before we develop these interventions to stay healthy longer. And so if you do nothing else, exercise and sleep, because those are the things that are going to help you no matter what.
All right, well, wonderful. Well, thank you. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your day. And it is lunchtime here in Chicago, and I'm not on caloric restriction, so I'll head
Yeah,
there.
enjoy. Bon appetit.
Yes, thank you all. Bye.